So I grew up in Montana, mostly in Great Falls as a young, budding teenager. My dad was an artist. He was a painter and sculptor, taught high school as an art teacher, but he was also in a Dixieland band playing clarinet, saxophone. And I used to go and watch him practice. And I was so excited about the sounds that that band would have. I could see that these older guys that looked ancient to me had so much fun. And so I was inspired to start playing clarinet in junior high school. Pubescent teenager, learning clarinet, probably not the best instrument to try and pick up chicks. So I had an uncle in Chicago that I visited one summer when I was 15, and it changed my life. I was so blown away. He was a jazz drummer, had this beautiful kit, and his drumming was great. He was a jazz drummer, but I had just heard amazing Van Halen records and Scorpions records, and I could see being this rock drummer as more of an identity. So I think at that point, MTV had just started airing all the real hair band videos, and so I saw Motley Crue. As soon as I saw Tommy Lee smacking the drums, I thought, that's what I needed to do. So I tossed the clarinet to my dad's dismay, and I started just learning on my own. Didn't take lessons, but I was so inspired that I consumed everything drums. I was practicing to records, so having to take the needle, put it back to the beginning, mostly Kiss records and that kind of thing, 70s stuff. And my aspirations were to move to Hollywood, be a big rock star. So my dad retired from teaching. He was really supportive of my music career, but he was so burned out teaching that he wanted to move to a family cabin that he and my grandfather had built way back in the woods outside of Bozeman, Montana, where there were no neighbors. There was no interaction with anybody. So I was an angry, pissed off teenager. The only thing I had that could be a respite was to play drums. And when it was beautiful weather, I'd take my drums out, and it was a log cabin we grew up in. I'd bring my drums outside. I'd string speakers outside and blast as loud as I could and play drums. And you could hear the drums echoing down the canyon. And thankfully, there were no neighbors to complain about. So it was more of a cathartic sort of stress management tool. But I had these aspirations that I was going to play music for a living. I wanted to be a rock drummer. And I was so upset that I was dating my childhood sweetheart back in the other town. And when they moved me away, I felt like they brought me away from friends, brought me away from my girlfriend. And we moved to kind of a rural town. It's a college town, but everybody there were cowboys. And I was this long-haired rocker dude with a mullet. And the last thing I wanted to do was hang out with the jocks and the cowboys. And so football games and everything else that was kind of the popular thing to do, I'd only go to football games if I could watch the drummers in the drum line. And I had so much resentment for being this outsider there in high school that it just drove me to be even more successful as a drummer. I finally ended up reconnecting with my girlfriend when I was able to drive, and driving back and forth 3 hours each way to see my girlfriend. And she knew my aspirations were to get out of Montana and go play music. And so when I went to college right after high school to study first art, because I'd been doing painting and sculpting like my dad, a lot of drawing. And the first quarter, I realized I wasn't inspired to be using that kind of medium anymore. And my girlfriend and I took off to Europe for a couple of months to backpack around. And it was 1989. So we were there 2 months. We were there when the Berlin Wall came down. So we went, I think we were coming back from Greece through Italy when we heard about the wall coming down, took a train there, and watching how much energy and life was being sort of reborn in Berlin was a really special moment. And I came back from Europe after a couple months, recharged, went a different route in school. And I knew that music was my first love, but I loved people at that point too. My mom had been a social worker, and we had a lot of kids from foster homes growing up in our house. And I felt like there's some way that I could work with kids and still do music as a career. So I took sociology as my major, and I had a music studio teaching option in college, got my degree in those, and worked at a youth shelter, playing music on the weekends and working jobs just to be able to pay for college. I should say that during high school, when my aspirations were to go to Hollywood and to be a rock star, my dad got me my first gig in 1987 playing at an art gallery for $35. And I just found this journal entry that I wrote the day before my gig talking about how my life was going to change. At that point, I was getting paid as a professional musician to go play music 3 hours from my home. So playing the ski resorts and bars back in Montana, I was in high school playing 5 nights a week, but my parents thought I was just working a day job because I was afraid, because my dad was a recovering alcoholic, he didn't want me in bars. So while they supported me in music, the last thing they wanted me to do was be around alcohol. They knew I had the genetic predisposition to be a partier. And so I'd lie to my parents. Oh, I have a gig coming up, but I'm playing a frat party, or I'm playing a private corporate event, I'm playing a country club. And I played this ski bar outside of Bozeman, Montana, one night when my dad popped in. I saw him come in the door, and I immediately asked the guys to take a break because he was still at the door. And the band took a break. I ran around the side. I went outside waiting for the set to end, or the break to end. And my dad came out and said, "You making good money?" I said, "Yeah, I am. I'm doing all right." And he said, "All right, I support it. Good for you." He knew that I was afraid to be around the party scene. I knew that while he'd been dry my whole life, they put the fear of God into me, that I had the bug, that alcohol was not going to be my friend. So support from my dad for sure. He said, "Well, you won't tell your mom about it, just to be cautious." But by the time I was in college and playing so many gigs, I think I had really essentially paid for almost my entire college through cover gigs. At that point, I had 2 cover bands, and then I was playing an original project that really changed my whole outlook on music. There was a progressive kind of fusion band whose bass player had gone to Montreux Jazz Festival, and he was recognized as an innovative bass player. And he took me under his wing, and he wanted me to play in kind of a fusion rock band. And at that point, the 80s rock scene had kind of gotten tired, and there were bands like Living Colour and Fishbone that had more of a funk fusion sort of bent on them. And so he wanted a band like that, and it really pushed me. So my skills increased a lot. Doing the studio option in college, I learned a lot about work in the studio, voice training, and audio skills, and I felt like I was getting enough of an education that I could go to most cities and probably hold my own as a drummer. But I still couldn't convince my fiance at that point to go to the big cities. She didn't want to go to LA. I was convinced that maybe Seattle would be a good outlet. And when my friends who were working on the college committee for concerts brought in this band called Mookie Blaylock, at that point, I went in, and most of the concerts I would work, I'd end up as a drum tech because they didn't have them if they were at a lower level, and I would just want to hang out with the drummers and talk to them. So this band, between the time they booked them and the time they played, changed their name to Pearl Jam. And the band had already had one video out that was just starting to take off, but the band was still small enough that they were playing the Pig Barn at the fairgrounds in Bozeman, Montana. They came in, they had one crew guy for the whole band. He was setting up drums, didn't know anything about drums. The drum heads were so wrinkled, he just really hadn't even tuned up the kit. And I asked him, "Hey, can I tune up that kit?" He said, No. He likes them. Leave them like that. But I tuned him up anyway. And he came in. Dave Aberzees was the drummer. He walked in. He did a sound check, loved the sound of the drums. And their tech, Scully, said, yeah, he knew that I had done something to him, and talked to me about, "Is this what you do?" And I said, "No, I'm a drummer. I wouldn't call myself a tech at all." But Dave Aberzees, really, we clicked. We hit it off. Before the show, right during the show, I just sat right behind him, and I was so blown away by the power and the energy of this band that was taking off, just poised to be the biggest band in the world at that point. And we connected, and he stayed in touch. He was showing me a bunch of his parts right after the show, and then we stayed in touch on the phone. They went to Europe, and he wrote to me in Europe. I just found the first letter that wrote out all of his parts for me, kind of choreographed it, or he charted out the parts, and then he invited me to come and stay with my fiance out to his place in Seattle as they were working on the second record. And we got to see the recording in the studio. He took us out for dinners, and we saw how he was not flamboyant with the newfound money, but he was really involved in his community. So he'd go support local bands every night. I watched the way he interacted with bands that had not yet made it, and I could see that you could still be this incredibly accomplished musician with great success, but stay humble and stay connected to people. And it inspired the hell out of me. So my fiance and I went back, and I told her I could really see being in Seattle. He offered to connect me with all of his people, and he was such a good, down-to-earth guy that I was ready to go to Seattle. She was just graduating college and didn't really want to move to a bigger city. So while she was finishing school, I helped a friend move out to Portland. I'd never been here, and it was 40 below when I left Montana at 6 a.m. in the morning, and I got out to the Columbia Gorge probably 10 o'clock at night. It was unseasonably warm in January, 60 degrees, and everything lush and green. I fell in love with it before I even hit Portland. By the time I got into the city and I found these amazing clubs, I asked everybody, where are the places to go? And so, of course, went to Satyricon and the X-Ray Cafe. All of these places had such great energy. This is 1993, and Portland was really primed to do something special. And I just felt like I belonged. So I called my fiance. Well, actually, we'd just gotten married. And I called her and said, I know we've talked about where you didn't want to go, but I found some place that I want you to trust me. I love Portland. And she was always sort of taking a backseat to my dreams my whole life. She knew that I had these aspirations, and she supported them. And so there was no pushing back when I told her I felt like Portland was the place. So finished up school. I auditioned for a couple of bands to see if I could hold my own. So there were bands, Silicone Jones and Itty Bitty, that I auditioned for both of these bands, and I got in, but I hadn't moved here yet. So I had to tell them, I don't live here, but I just wanted to see if I could hold my own. Dick move, but they were great about it. And I moved back to Portland. I moved to Portland 6 months after that with my band. I had a band from Montana that I wanted to move out with, but the bass player took too long to move out. By the time I got to Portland, the singer for that band, Dave Rummins, I went out to see him at a club called Mark's Hawthorne Pub in 1994, and the band he opened for changed my life, blew my mind. Leah Kruger and Greg Kirkley were in that band. It was called Analama. And they had a drummer who had been working the door at the club when they weren't playing. And he looks like he had a drinking problem. He was real sloppy that night, not just during the performance, but he came over and charged me an extra cover charge because he was looking for more money for booze. And the band was so good. The lead singer, she had the greatest voice, but was an amazing bass player. And I was rocked. I couldn't believe this band in this tiny little club. And they asked Dave, my friend who was singing that night, hey, do you know any drummers that might be able to do this gig in Seattle we've got coming up? We just don't really think that this guy's going to be able to pull it off. And he said, yeah, the guy that was at the show last night. And they said, okay, let's get a hold of him. They called me. They said, we've got a show in Seattle. Wondering if you'd be interested in playing. And I said, oh, of course. So they gave me a cassette and said, all right, the gig's tomorrow. So you've got 24 hours, no rehearsal, got to come do the gig. And I was so excited because I fell in love with the band the first time I saw them. And from that point, I started rehearsing with the band after the gig. The gig was great, but moment changed for me. I was a heavy metal drummer from Montana. I showed up with 2 bass drums and a ton of cymbals and all these toms. And the guitarist helped me get my drums out of my truck. And he said, you're not going to need the second bass drum. That's a little overkill. And my mind was a little blown. I thought, that's not who I am, right? But the show was so great. I drove home on a high and I thought, this band to me, is everything I kind of wanted. An amazing songwriter. The girl up front, her songwriting was amazing. Her voice was amazing. And as a drummer, playing with a bass player that would rock your world was such an amazing opportunity. So we rehearsed and prepped a recording. We were going to do a first record, but they hadn't yet let their other drummer go. I didn't know that. So as we were in the rehearsals, he finally showed up one night, threw a fit, and I recognized, okay, there's something about communication with band members that is really key, really important to be able to be transparent and upfront, something I would learn much more about later on. And that band for 4.5 years was the entire focus of my aspirations. I worked as a assistant manager for a Musicland where I would suggest sell all of our CDs. And it was one of those corporate mall music stores that was supposed to sell Garth Brooks and Alanis Morissette CDs. And every time somebody would come in for Alanis, I'd say, hang on, before you get that, I know you've heard those songs on the radio, but check out this band. And I sold so many of those CDs. And then I would tell people, oh yeah, so it's my band. We're playing tomorrow night. If you come to the show, I'm going to make you a guarantee. If you come to the show and you don't like the band, I'll give you your money back. And more people would come out. And I just felt so much pride in that band that I would drag bodies down to shows. I would just drag people left and right. And it was more about my connection with the band and the music than it was about wanting to be a rock star. But the band was really interested in achieving some success because we had goals not to have mansions and millions of dollars, but to change people's lives. Mid-90s, our singer, she was great about wanting to get healthcare to musicians that couldn't afford it. So long before socialized medicine, right? She wanted to have a program where musicians could somehow have subsidies for healthcare with programs that we could raise with the attention and awareness that we get from success. So we were primed for bigger things. We were playing with bigger bands. Since I was working in the music stores, I talked to a lot of people in the industry about coming out to do showcases. Record labels were looking at a lot of bands in Seattle and starting to look at bands in Portland. So we did some showcasing in Seattle. We showcased for Lava Records, who ended up signing Goodness out of Seattle. The Mayfield Four was a band that we were playing with a bunch that got a record deal with Capitol. And when one of the labels said, hey, before we come out, your manager suggested that we just showcase Leah, your singer, and not the band. And I said, we don't have a manager. And they said, well, this is who we talked to. And I went and I talked to the band about it, the transparent conversation. And there was a little bit of a denial there at first. And the more that I would talk to this label rep, they said, yeah, no, this is absolutely what they're trying to, they see that she's the focus. One of the labels that we showcased for, there was a management company. So Susan Silver, Chris Cornell's wife, she and Eric Hoppy came to this show that we did in Seattle. And Eric and Susan sat me down and said, this band could never be signed as is. There are three distinctive personalities in this band that are so different that there's no continuity on stage. You've got this amazing singer she's pouring her heart out, and she's got these wrist slashing ballads. And then your guitarist is aloof, and he turns around away from the crowd like he'd rather be anywhere else but there. And you're up there bouncing around, smiling like a circus monkey. And I didn't want to hear it. I felt like, you know what, somebody's going to see this band and think this is exactly what they needed to push us to the next level. But the label that had said, you know what, your manager is trying to get the deal, it stuck with me. And when I talked to the band about it, my last show, I said, I think our goals are different. I could see that it wasn't going to work. I left. The band ended up sort of being signed. Again, they signed the singer, and she went down to Los Angeles for a development deal and was shelved. And it was really tragic. The label ended up really basically destroying her spirit. I think at that point, that gift that she had for songwriting and singing, she brought it back with her to Portland, kind of tail between her legs, started a new band, joined another existing band, Dirty Martini, and when Dirty Martini fired her for some of the whatever dynamic was going on, that was the end for her. So it was so tragic and hard to see somebody with that gift. I think the best songwriter I've ever worked with hung it up to dry and hasn't played since. So for me, I could see all sides of the pros and cons in the industry and what it could do to you. I also stayed in touch with my friend from Pearl Jam, the drummer. When I moved out from Montana, I would connect with him and try to get shows booked up in Seattle with other bands. And almost immediately he got fired from the band at the height of their popularity. So my aspirations of rock stardom could see the peak and then major valleys. I could see that it was an industry that was insidious and more than just a tough battle, but it was fickle. So at the point that I left that band, when the band was primed with this record deal, I had really kept my wife at bay. She wanted to be a mom more than anything else. And I wanted to be a dad, but I wanted rockstar more. So I made a deal with her that 28 was the magic year for me, that I would do what I could musically. And if things just didn't get to where I needed them to be, then let's start and have a family. When I left Onalama, I chose to, we started having the discussion about family. We had our first son. And then I really had the bug to play with people that would appreciate me and had aligned goals, since I felt like that was the biggest disconnect before. And I started playing with a lot of local musicians, guys that had made a name for themselves, Jeff Lebansky and Nicole Campbell, Brian Cutler, several bands that were really wonderful songwriters and musicians, and I connected with at some level. But I really didn't have any aspiration at that point to do anything as a career. At that point, I'd kind of hung it up, and I wanted to play music for fun and make my family the primary focus. And then I got a call from Bill Wadhams of Animotion. And of course, I knew the band from the 80s when I was a kid. I roller skated to their songs with my girlfriend, and I thought, oh, this sounds great. We sat down. He told me we've got one show booked in Fresno, which is the hometown for a few guys in the band, and it's just going to be a local gig. Happened to be on my birthday. And I said, oh, what a cool birthday gift to go and play with this internationally known band for one show. And the guitarist from the band had been with Rod Stewart for the last 20 years. And the keyboardist was the keyboardist for the Michael Jackson Thriller record. And he'd been with Jose Feliciano at that point. So he'd been doing a lot of international work. And when we had this sound check, it was a totally different level than anything I'd played in. I could see the professionalism. The guitarist, Don Kirkpatrick, turned to me and turned to the singer, Bill, and he said, where'd you find this drummer? We finally got a real drummer. We should do more gigs. And I was all in. They started booking shows right after that. So my first international show with the band was in Toronto at the iconic Massey Hall. And we played this amazing cancer benefit for children with, like early onset leukemia, I think. And Camp Trillion was the organization. But the event was hosted by Mike Myers, and they had all these celebrities. And so I got to see this new level with my band, where celebrities were at the show, and it was at a famous venue, and I was traveling internationally. I got a little taste of it, and I was so excited about it that, again, that lit the fire under me. So playing with an internationally recognized band like Animotion changed the way I looked at playing music. I could see that it wasn't going to be a career moneymaker, but I could do all the things I wanted to do. Play great venues with bands that I loved when I grew up, and I could still be my stay-at-home dad role. I could still work a corporate gig and make some decent money. And so it made a job seem easier because I could play what I loved, or do something that made me happy outside. And I had a whole new energy about playing music. And Animotion started doing 12 to 15 shows a year in great venues. My first arena shows playing in Miami, and with bands that I grew up loving. Bands like Missing Persons and Berlin and the Human League. And so it was as great to be doing those shows with my band, but to get to see these other bands, hanging out with them backstage, and we all became friends. It was like a family reunion every time we do package shows with these bands. And so they started sniffing around, seeing if I'd be up for playing with those gigs, just subbing on these gigs. So I would play for Missing Persons in Vegas, or I'd play with New Shoes or Tommy Two-Tone in Orlando. And it was the best of all worlds. It was great to get to meet the other musicians and develop relationships with them, get to play these great gigs, get out of Portland when it's rainy in the middle of January and go to Florida. But it also gave me perspective, getting to see people that had been maybe really successful in the 80s and then coming back around and having been humbled by maybe being a one-hit wonder and having to go to their corporate jobs and learning about appreciating what they had. So there were a lot of learning lessons all the way through, and I never wanted to take it for granted. So I did the Animotion gig for 15 years. So while I was playing with Animotion and I was working this great corporate job, 9/11 had happened, technology was taking a hit, stocks were dropping. So the tech company that I worked for was trying to cut a lot of costs, and the world got a lot more complex in the workplace. They brought in a guy that was not at all conducive to the type of work environment I had. He was a hardcore evangelist who thought rock and roll was evil. Didn't know that I was out touring with a band, but my customers, the people that I worked with there at the company, would come in and say, "Oh, we saw you last night on NBC doing that show with Animotion." And he overheard them and he came in and said, "What's this about this thing you did on TV?" And I said, "Oh, it's my band." And he said, "Is that why you're taking off these Fridays and Mondays to go off and play music?" And he said, "I got to take care of my family." And he said, "Where are you playing this weekend? I see that you got Friday off." And I said, "I'm playing Las Vegas." And he said, "You know that Vegas is Sin City, right?" And I said, "Yeah, man, if it wasn't for Vegas, God wouldn't even have a job." I was just pushing. I had a lot of resentment towards the judgment, and it was the beginning of the end for me. The corporate life at that point I was done with it. And I wanted to play music for me. I wanted to be able to call my own shots. And so I left the corporate world. I left the golden handcuffs to try and do music on my own. I'd been doing web design since the early days of Analama, and I knew that I could probably scrounge up enough clients on my own to keep that business going, play music with Animotion, and still have time for my family. And my mental health would probably appreciate it too. So as Animotion proceeded, we did a few more gigs every year, and I played a lot of music in the Portland area at that point too. The Portland music scene had really blown up with tribute bands. Jason Fellman started this organization, J Fell Presents, that was primarily geared towards tribute acts. And he had an AC/DC tribute act under his roster and a Guns N' Roses tribute act. He had this amazing Journey band that he started that really became successful. And at first, when the tribute thing became a popular outlet, people laughed at it until the tribute band started selling out the bigger theaters. And you could see that not only was it lucrative, but there was a huge market for it. There was this empty void for people that wanted to hear music that they recognized beyond cover band status. They wanted to go out and feel like they were part of the days back in the 80s. And I could relate because Animotion was the same sort of vibe where we'd do big shows with Berlin and the Human League, and people would dress up, big hair and lots of neon, and go back to the 80s where they could leave behind all the stresses of today. The escape was really important for these people, that they could go put behind dealing with their kids or their bills and politics and all the stuff that was challenging as this generation was dealing with, and they could forget about it for a few hours and escape. So the tribute act, the same kind of thing. They felt like they close their eyes and they get an experience that was very much like having seen AC/DC in 1981 or something. And it was a lot of fun. It was fun to be in those bands too. That people, the bands themselves, I think the energy was really focused on enjoying the company of each other and really feeding off the energy from people that would go to the shows. So I felt a lot of support in the community through that environment. And at the same point, I was stretching myself really thin. I was working a lot of clients. I was playing in 2 tribute bands. I was traveling with Animotion. And the focus was not so much on the relationship I developed with my wife. And I didn't know at the time that she was really struggling with a lot of her childhood trauma that had manifested into horrible feelings of guilt and shame that she never got resolved. And so she started drinking heavily, but without me knowing about it. I was out with friends and got a DUI one night after I was drinking socially. I was at a business meeting for a while, and then I went out to drink with friends afterwards. And I knew that I was, again, predisposed to have the genetic alcoholism traits, but I recognized that I probably had too much to drink. So I waited for a while until this venue closed and felt like I was sober enough to drive home. I got pulled over. I blew a .08 right at the legal limit, but it was enough of a wake-up call sitting in jail thinking about what I had done to my kids. They were both becoming teenagers, and recognizing that it was really easy for me to think that I was sober enough to drive because I built up a tolerance. I knew I was predisposed to be really irresponsible in my drinking. And over the course of the years, I had really gotten caught up in all the mania that went along with the music scene, traveling a lot to Canada. I met a guy that was a horrible influence, but the most enjoyable party guy that I'd ever met. Introduced me to cocaine, and it felt like it was the exact recipe that was invented for me because I never had to sleep. I was stretched so thin that I thought, oh, cocaine could keep me awake, and I never have to sort of let any of those plates I was juggling, let any of them fall. And the people that he had me hanging around were at first celebrities and really important people in high positions politically, and then it turned into involvement with well-known motorcycle club that really had nefarious activities going on. None of that really struck home until I got sober and recognized how much wreckage I was leaving behind and how much damage this could have done to my family. So when I chose sobriety, that's when I recognized that the relationship I had with my wife was in trouble, that her drinking was getting out of hand. She lost a lot of jobs, crashed all the cars. She was driving with the kids, drunk a lot. And I felt so much resentment about some of the choices that she made without really looking at how much I contributed to those things because of my pursuit for musical appreciation and stardom. And while we tried to work those things out, a flock of seagulls called me and they said, our drummer burned his hands really bad. We need a drummer for this 80s cruise to go to the Bahamas and Puerto Rico and Turks and Caicos Islands. It pays really well, and you could still do your Animotion gigs, but we think you'd be great for the job. And I'd befriended these guys for several years. We played shows with them with Animotion. So I knew that I got along with the guys really well. The drummer was a friend of mine, and I felt like, well, I'm glad to fill in and help out while he's recovering. And they booked a couple of gigs prior so that we could be ready. And the first gig in Las Vegas was fantastic. I was excited because the band was sounding great. Music was stuff that I grew up on. And so I asked, can I bring my wife on this 80s cruise? I think for me, I felt like it was a last-ditch effort to see if we could reconnect, finding those things that we had in the past. And the cruise was amazing. Lots of fun experiences with great artists. Really got close to bands like Wang Chung. And, we played with Huey Lewis and spent a great time with him and Richard Marx. But the connection with my wife wasn't there. And we separated shortly after. The band, shortly after, also asked me to join as a permanent member. The drummer just didn't work out. And so I was in a position where I was looking at the relationship dissolution of my childhood sweetheart. We met when we were 12. She went through all of that pursuit of musical stardom, really taking a back seat, hoping that we could navigate this process together. But I really couldn't see her surviving this. I saw her drinking and drug use ending up with her dead. And so I had her go into treatment. We really tried to work those things out. When I finally just had enough, it was a crossroads for me. It was tough because the band, the Flock of Seagulls, had asked me to join. I was trying to balance that with Animotion. And then the singer we'd do some shows together where I'd play with both bands. And it really wasn't fair to either band because I couldn't put 100% commitment into both bands and give them they all. And our singer from A Flock of Seagulls, Mike Scorer, said, I'd rather have you I don't want to look like we have hired guys in the band. I want to have a band up front. And I left Animotion after over 15 years. And it ended up being fantastic that the relationship that I developed with that band was so close that when I left, they were able to get their original drummer back after 30 years and still play a lot of shows with the Flock of Seagulls and Animotion. And so I would be out there supporting them when they were opening shows, and they knew that they had my back. And A Flock of Seagulls ended up being a really successful band over the last several years. The singer was involved in a lot of licensing, so the music stayed current. He had music in all these big time movies and video games, so there were generations of people coming out to see the shows, and we played a lot more than Animotion ever did. We were playing 60 to 75 shows a year, playing all over the world. The biggest shows of my life. Last year at this point, playing Quebec City for 90,000 people with Corey Hart, and I never thought that approaching this age, I was going to get to play the biggest shows of my life in the biggest venues. But a lot of it had to do with relationship management on the music side, for sure, communication, and trying to make sure that for me, the hang was as important as my abilities musically. So now I've got a son who's 21 and was an amazing drummer. At 16, his chops were much better than mine. He was an avid Rush fan, so Neil Peart was God to him. And I was excited because I had this little protege, my son, that was coming up in the ranks, and he got really tired of being in Dad's shadow. And so he developed a huge interest in rap and hip hop and R&B, and he wanted to be a singer. And I understood that he was always going to be, at least in my shadow, in the local community. Everybody knew that Dad was a drummer, so of course he's a drummer. And he had an identity that he wanted to create. So now he's got a couple of records out. He's been doing rap and hip hop. And I'm excited to see that his fire is strong. You know, he's got the aspirations to move to Hollywood, same kind of stuff that I did. And while I would want to throw my recommendations about speed bumps he might want to avoid, it's his journey. It's completely different than mine. He doesn't want my advice. My advice may not help him very much other than the communication part. If I can impart any of that wisdom from my failures, it's about real healthy communication. I've got a younger son who's 19. He's an amazing singer, trying to find his voice. And I don't think music is going to be his end goal, but he also was very shy and introverted. So the communication part is equally as strong for his success. And I think as I proceed outside the pandemic, where we're going to be out touring, I think I've gained some perspective from taking a break for nearly a year now about how important it is to really take appreciation for every single moment that you can interact as an artist, not take anything for granted. I would think that most people recognize that now, that when we've been stifled in creativity for 10 months now in a pandemic, that they never want to take anything for granted. And I'm appreciative. There's the silver lining behind everything shutting down. While my spirit has been dashed and doused, I feel like it's going to be that much more intense and appreciated once we get it back. That's the optimistic side of me. The other side cracked a month ago, and I tried to take my life. Depression for the last 3 months was spinning when I lost the sense of my identity. I was interviewing other musicians for a podcast that I have every day and taking on the emotional strain from hearing other musicians who were struggling with the loss of their identity, loss of their income. And I slowly took a little bit of each of their stories, and it fed into a massive depression wave for me. So I isolated. And I'm an extrovert. Everybody socially knows me as an extrovert, a hugger, somebody that's out, sort of always optimistic. The Silver Lining is the name of my business, Silver Lining Media. And it was, I think, a projection of trying to be optimistic all the time, but realizing that there was this deep-seated depression in me as an artist and as a creative type that stifled that. It pushed it down, and I didn't have good skills to cope with it. So the last 3 months got dark, and during the pandemic, I started to isolate. I stopped doing my shows as much because I really couldn't put on a face that was positive. And I also hid out from my children because I could see that their depression was also increasing. The pandemic was really tough for them, not being able to be in person with school or with jobs. My older son had gotten in quite a bit of trouble the last year, and a lot of it revolved around his depression and his self-image. And so my own depression, I felt like I needed to hide that from my kids. And so I isolated and I withdrew from the world. And it manifested so dark that one night I just couldn't take it anymore. And I took the rest of the sleeping pills that I had and woke up throwing up, so dizzy that I thought I was already dead. And I thought that was my death, was sickness and spinning and chaos. And when I came to, I could hear my kids in the next room on the computers at 4 o'clock in the morning, laughing with each other. They were playing a game. And I realized how out of my mind I had gotten with this disease, the mental health piece that I had overlooked for a long time. I'd been in a relationship over the last several years with a girlfriend after my divorce that I projected, and I had no accountability for my part in a lot of things that happened. I broke up with this gal thinking that she was crazy, that a lot of her expectations were unreasonable, and that if she couldn't accept me for who I am, then I'd have to walk. All of these realizations hit me during this depression phase where I realized that I hadn't seen any of my responsibility for that or the decline in my relationship with my wife, the issues that I had with my former boss that I left, bands that I had walked away from. My part in all of those things was stifled so deep that I didn't see any of it until this wave hit me. And this pendulum swung so hard that instead of seeing my part in it, I was seeing accountability for everything. I assumed 100% responsibility for all of the relationship woes that I had in those things. Again, the importance of healthy communication. I didn't have it when it came to uncomfortable things to talk about. And so as I cleaned up from my attempt, I knew that I needed to talk to somebody. I knew that it was outside any grasp that I had. And it was 4 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday. Monday, I was able to call a therapist. She had me talk to my doctor, who immediately had me admitted to hospital for an inpatient program to basically stabilize my well-being, my mental health. And in there, I recognized that there were deep-seated issues that I'd had from my childhood, not feeling like I was maybe good enough. So as we're our formative years as a musician, we're always trying to impress somebody, always feeling like you have to impress someone. Doesn't matter whether you're a musician or anything else, but I recognized that even though I had support from my family, I always wanted to make them proud. I always felt like I needed to be more. And trying to live up to that, I wanted to be perfect. I wanted to be liked by everybody. And I started questioning my sincerity of wanting to be liked so much. Was that authentic? Was I really that nice guy that was out getting to meet everybody and be favored? Or was it an act to try and get attention for something that I lacked when I was younger? I've done a lot of work in the last month on that self-reflection, looking at the truth in some of that speculation about where I was placing my attention, and recognize that overwhelming consumption of wanting to play music for fulfillment and for success, also left a wake of destruction behind from people that I valued, but I didn't show that value enough. So the pendulum is swinging a little bit less now, where I don't accept all responsibility for everything that happened, but I certainly see my part in it and realize that if I could go back and talk to the younger Kevin in the mountains in Montana, I would start working on that emotional development before getting to 50 and having to learn to walk before I crawl again right now. If I were to talk to teenage Kevin Rankin about ways to do things differently, if I would talk to a teenager maybe that had the same aspirations that I did, I would let them know that if music as a career was what you wanted more than anything else, you have to realize that you have to do it for the passion, the fulfillment. You cannot think about the economic part of it because it's so fickle, the industry, that unless you have all the control in the world, there's no way you're going to be able to control your environment the way you might from a traditional job. And I heard this saying a couple of days ago about trying to essentially have a conversation with the ocean to control its current, which is impossible. And the only way for you to really feel fulfilled in music is to do it because your spirit and your heart tells you to do it. If you want to do it as a career, learn the other aspects, learn about business and learn about managing money, learn about contracts and legal things. Maybe you're not going to be the next singer, the next Taylor Swift as a songwriter, but you'll understand that you can be part of the business if you get the business acumen. But to me, that's not what stirs my spirit. Interacting with people on stage is where you can really get the emotional connection. I wouldn't go into music because you have aspirations of making $1 million and having a mansion, riding in limos. But if you knew that you could have a deep-seated physical, emotional connection with your bandmates and convey that to the rest of the world, then there's nothing better. There's nothing better than being on stage when everything's clicking and you're feeling this transcendence that I don't think you can get anywhere else.
It's fun.
Yeah.